Did you know that Nebraska is sitting on top of the largest sand dune formation in the Western Hemisphere? And you'd never know it because the whole thing is covered in grass. Or that a volcano erupted nearly 1,000 miles away and turned a Nebraska waterhole into a prehistoric graveyard that scientists are still digging up today. How about the fact that Nebraska planted an entire national forest from scratch by hand in the middle of a desert, just to prove everyone wrong? Well, there's a lot more to the Cornhusker State than flat land and corn. This massive stretch of prairie is hiding some of the most mind-bending geography, geology, and ecology on the continent. And we've got 50 facts to prove it. Let's get to it. Fact 50. Nebraska is carved into dramatically different worlds. Most people picture Nebraska as one big flat thing. It isn't. From the rolling sand dunes of the Sandhills to the rugged pine canyons of the Northwest, from the ancient chalk Badlands near the South Dakota border to the humid hardwood forest crowding the eastern rivers, Nebraska contains half a dozen distinct landscapes stacked side by side. The elevation swings more than 4,500 feet from the southeast corner to the panhandle. The annual rainfall in the east is more than twice what falls in the west. Nebraska doesn't look diverse. It just quietly is. Fact 49. Driving across Nebraska means climbing a mountain you'll never feel. Sound familiar? Same trick as the neighbor to the south. Drive from Omaha to the Wyoming border, and you'll gain over 4,500 feet in elevation. That's higher than plenty of named peaks back east. But Nebraska does it on a grade so gradual, roughly 8 feet per mile, that your body registers none of it. You'll just notice the air getting drier, the grass getting shorter, and the sky getting bigger. It's a slow-motion mountain climb disguised as a boring highway, and it happens to you every single time. Fact 48. The highest point in Nebraska looks exactly like nothing. Panorama Point sits at 5,424 feet above sea level, Nebraska's official summit. There's no peak, no view worth photographing, no trail to hike. It's a flat patch of private ranch land in the Panhandle, accessible via a dirt road on an honor system visit. You walk through a gate, stand on a modest rise of grass, and that's it. The highest point in the state is functionally indistinguishable from the 1,000 acres around it. In Nebraska, even the rooftop is modest. Fact 47. Nebraska's name literally means flat water. The state's name comes from the Ottawa word Nebraska, meaning flat water, a description of the Platte River, the great shallow highway that cuts east to west across the state. When French explorers arrived, they called it La Platte, also meaning flat. So Nebraska was named after a river that was itself named for being flat, twice, in 2 languages. Early pioneers had a more colorful take. They called the Platte a mile wide and an inch deep, and too thick to drink, too thin to plow. It is, in a sense, the most honestly named state in the Union. Fact 46. The Platte River was once a mile wide. Now it's a shadow of itself. Those pioneers weren't exaggerating. The Platte once spread across an entire mile of braided channels and shifting sandbars. Snowmelt from the Rockies fanning out across the plains every spring and scouring the riverbed clean. The annual flood is what made it a perfect stopover for millions of migrating birds. Open sandbars, no trees, nothing to hide a predator. But a century of irrigation diversions and upstream reservoirs have strangled the river. In some stretches, it collapsed to a few hundred feet wide. The sandbars are filling in, the trees are creeping in, and the birds that depend on open water are losing one of the most important corridors on the continent, one diverted gallon at a time. Fact 45. 500,000 cranes land on one stretch of river every spring. And yet, for now, one of the greatest wildlife spectacles on Earth still happens in Nebraska every February and March. Over 500,000 sandhill cranes, 80% of the entire global population, funnel into a 70-mile stretch of the Platte River Valley. They arrive from Texas, Florida, and Mexico. They leave for Alaska, Canada, and eastern Siberia. Nebraska is the pit stop in between, a peak migration. The sky turns gray with birds at dawn and dusk. The sound has been described as a roar. Scientists have confirmed these cranes have been migrating through Nebraska for at least 9 million years, longer than the Platte River itself has existed. Fact 44. The Platte River is why those cranes survived the trip. The cranes just don't rest on the Platte. They depend on it to fuel a journey thousands of miles long. Each bird spends about a month in the Platte Valley, doubling its body weight on waste corn left behind in harvest fields. The river itself provides the roost, shallow, open, braided channels where cranes can stand in the water overnight, protected from predators by the current and the open sightlines. Remove the Platte's braided structure, let the channels narrow, and the trees take over, and those 500,000 cranes have nowhere safe to sleep. This river, this shallow, unimpressive trickle, is load-bearing infrastructure for one of the greatest migrations on the planet. Fact 43. Nebraska is sitting on top of the largest sand dune formation in the Western Hemisphere. The Nebraska Sandhills cover 20,000 square miles, roughly a quarter of the entire state. They are the biggest stabilizing sand dune system in the Western Hemisphere, with individual dunes reaching 400 feet high and stretching 20 miles wide. They formed from the Rocky Mountain sediment carried east by ancient rivers, then sculpted by wind after the Ice Age. But you'd never know you were standing on dunes, because a thin, fragile layer of prairie grass has pinned them in place for thousands of years. Pull up the grass, and the dunes move again. That's not a theory. That's happened before. Fact 42. The Sandhills dunes have collapsed and reactivated at least twice in human history. The grass holding those 20,000 square miles of dune in place is not guaranteed. Researchers have found evidence that the Sandhills destabilized and blew free around 3,500 years ago when drought stripped the vegetation, then stabilized again about 1,500 years ago when rainfall returned. Scientists estimate that without enough precipitation, the dunes would go active again within decades. The single thing standing between central Nebraska and a Sahara-style sand sea is a thin mat of native grass sitting on top of an ancient wind-blown Rocky Mountain sediment. Climate change is currently testing that arrangement in real time. Fact 41. The Sandhills have more water in them than you can imagine. People look at the Sandhills and see dry and inhospitable terrain. They're looking at it wrong. Underneath those dunes sits one of the most water-rich environments in the Great Plains. The porous sand acts like a giant sponge, absorbing rainfall and funneling it straight down into the Ogallala Aquifer below. Between the dunes, thousands of shallow lakes, wet meadows, and spring-fed streams appear like oases. If you poured all the groundwater stored underneath Nebraska's surface out across the state, it would cover the land 38 feet deep. The driest-looking quarter of Nebraska is secretly one of the best watered places on the continent. Fact 40. A botanist was told trees couldn't grow here. He planted a forest anyway. In the late 1800s, the conventional wisdom was absolute. Trees couldn't grow in the Nebraska Sandhills. The climate was too dry. The soil was too sandy. Even if you planted them, they'd die. University of Nebraska botanist Charles Bessey disagreed. In 1891, he ran an experiment. The trees lived. By 1902, he convinced President Theodore Roosevelt to designate the land as a National Forest Reserve. Workers hand-planted tree after tree, seedling after seedling, across the sand. Today, that experiment has become the largest hand-planted forest in the United States. 25,000 acres of pine growing in a place where everyone said nothing would ever grow. Fact 39. There are over 230 waterfalls in Nebraska. Nebraska has waterfalls, hundreds of them. The Niobrara River in north-central Nebraska has carved a canyon 200 to 300 feet deep through the Sandhills limestone, and along its banks, over 230 waterfalls cascade directly into the river or tumble down side canyon walls. The highest, Smith Falls, drops 63 feet in a spring-fed curtain of water that flows year-round. Backpacker magazine named the Niobrara one of the 10 best canoe rivers in America. Most people who have never been to Nebraska don't believe any of this is real. Fact 38. 6 completely different ecosystems collide at one Nebraska river. The Niobrara isn't just geologically wild, it's ecologically insane. At the 100th meridian, humid air masses from the east collide with dry air from the west, and the river valley becomes a mixing zone for 6 major ecosystems at once. Northern boreal forest, eastern deciduous forest, ponderosa pine woodland, tall grass prairie, mixed grass prairie, and short grass prairie. Paper birch trees that belong in Canada grow alongside ponderosa pines from the Black Hills, right next to species that have no business being this far from their home range. The Niobrara Valley is one of the most biologically diverse river corridors in the entire Great Plains, hidden in a state everyone thinks is uniform. Fact 37. Nebraska has its own Badlands, and almost nobody goes there. In the northwestern corner of Nebraska, the land just disintegrates. Toadstool Geologic Park is a moonscape of narrow clay pedestrials topped with slabs of sandstone, eroded into shapes that look exactly like toadstools. The formations date back 30 to 40 million years and are related to the same rocks you find at South Dakota's famous Badlands, just across the state line. Walking the trail, you'll find fossilized footprints pressed into the ground, the tracks of ancient rhinos being chased by entelodonts preserved in the rock for 30 million years. It's a half-mile-long frozen pursuit, and you can step right into it. Fact 36. Nebraska's Badlands hold a trackway of a predator chasing prey frozen in stone. The trackway at Toadstool is one of the strangest things in American paleontology. 3/4 of a mile of ancient stream bed preserved the footprints of entelodonts, pig-like predators also called hell pigs, chasing two species of rhinoceroses. The rhinos ran, the hell pigs followed. The wet stream bed captured every step. Then the stream bed buried and hardened over tens of millions of years. Today, you can walk the same path those animals ran and read the chase like a story in the ground. It's a snapshot of terror, written in stone before humans existed. Fact 35. Scotts Bluff was the most important landmark on the Oregon Trail. Out in the Panhandle, an 800-foot sandstone mesa rises out of the North Platte River Valley like a fortress wall. Scotts Bluff National Monument was the landmark that told 500,000 westward immigrants that they were finally making progress. After weeks of flat, featureless plains, the bluffs appeared on the horizon and the journals lit up. Thousands of wagons rolled past this rock. Their names and the ruts of their wheels are still visible in the earth. It's made of 33 million-year-old sediments from the Brule Formation and volcanic ash layers above, an ancient deposit that guided the greatest overland migration in American history. Fact 34. Chimney Rock was visible for years before pioneers could reach it. Just east of Scotts Bluff, Chimney Rock rises 325 feet above the plains. A sandstone needle on a cone-shaped mound, visible from miles away in every direction. It's mentioned in more Oregon Trail diaries and journals than any other single landmark on the route. Travelers could see it for 2 days before they reached it, and another full day after it disappeared behind them. Today, it's still eroding. Lightning strikes and weather have shortened it measurably since the 1840s. The spire you see now is a fraction of what those pioneers wrote about. What they saw was taller, sharper, more dramatic, and they couldn't stop writing about it. Fact 33. A supervolcano 1,000 miles away buried Nebraska in ash and killed everything at a waterhole. About 12 million years ago, a supervolcano erupted in what is now Idaho, an event roughly 1,000 times more powerful than Mount St. Helen. The ash cloud drifted east on the jet stream and settled over Nebraska in a layer a foot thick. At a waterhole in what is now northeastern Nebraska, herds of rhinos, three-toed horses, camels, and birds gathered to drink. They were trapped. The ash fell like snow and piled up around them. They inhaled the glassy particles. The smallest animals, birds and turtles, died in the first few days. The rhinos lasted nearly a month before their lungs finally failed. Every skeleton at the site shows the same bone disease caused by acute lung failure. They all died slow. Fact 32. You can watch paleontologists dig up those animals right now in real time. The site is called Ashfall Fossil Beds, and it's unlike any other fossil park on Earth. Instead of removing skeletons to a museum, scientists built the museum directly over the dig site. Visitors walk through a barn and look down at complete articulated skeletons still in the volcanic ash, exactly where those animals died 12 million years ago. Baby rhinos pressed up against their mothers, pregnant females frozen mid-step, fossil mouths still containing the remnants of their last meals. Excavation teams work through the summer while tourists watch. They estimate at least another decade of digging remains ahead of them in the current site alone. It's a live archaeological excavation of a prehistoric mass death, and you can pull up a chair and watch. Fact 31. Nebraska was a subtropical jungle 14 million years ago. At the base of a cliff near Ashfall, geologists have found petrified wood and the fossilized remains of alligators and large fish. 14 million years ago, Nebraska was humid and warm, forest and wet, nothing like the state you know today. Over the following millions of years, the climate cooled and dried. The forests retreated, and Nebraska slowly became the savanna it was when the volcano buried those animals. By the time humans arrived, it had transformed again into the sea of grass that explorers found. The Nebraska you see today is just the most recent version of a landscape that has completely reinvented itself multiple times. Fact 30, Nebraska was entirely underwater, twice. Long before the jungle, long before the savanna, Nebraska spent millions of years at the bottom of the ocean. During the Cretaceous period, roughly 75 million years ago, a shallow inland sea called the Western Interior Seaway split North America into two, from the Gulf of Mexico to the Arctic. Nebraska was submerged. The chalk and limestone formations visible across the state today are the compressed remains of that sea bottom. Packed with fossils of massive marine reptiles, prehistoric sharks, and giant predatory fish, this was once open ocean. The wheat fields of Nebraska are the floor of an ancient sea. Fact 29. A river in Nebraska has 200 waterfalls because it's the only one flowing directly over its bedrock. The Niobrara River has one geological quirk that no other river in Nebraska shares. It flows directly over its bedrock substrate rather than a bed of sand and sediment. Because the rock is right there at the surface, the river and its tributaries constantly find hard layers and soft layers and pour over the edges, creating waterfall after waterfall after waterfall. Most Great Plains geology stays hidden deep underground. On the Niobrara, it's exposed in the canyon walls and it runs under your canoe. The river itself is a moving geology lesson, and the 230 waterfalls are its footnotes. Fact 28. The Sandhills sit over the Ogallala Aquifer, the water supply for 80 million people. The same sand that forms the Sandhills is also the primary recharge zone for the Ogallala Aquifer, one of the largest freshwater reserves on Earth. Rain hits the Sandhills, soaks through the porous sand almost instantly, and drops straight into the aquifer below. The Ogallala underlines 174,000 square miles across 8 states and supplies drinking and irrigation water for roughly 80 million people. Nebraska sits over the deepest, most water-rich portion of the whole system, and the Sandhills are how it stays that way. Those dunes aren't just sand, they're a giant water filtration system keeping a continent's agriculture alive. Fact 27. Nebraska is the #1 irrigated state in the entire country. Nebraska pumps more groundwater for irrigation than any other state in America. 9.1 million irrigated acres drawing from the Ogallala beneath them. The green circles you see from the air across the Sandhills and the Platte Valley are center pivot irrigation systems, each one a quarter-mile arm rotating around a central well, pulling ancient water up from the underground and spraying it across the land. Some of those wells have dropped more than 100 feet since 1950. Nebraska is currently using the Ogallala faster than the Sandhills can recharge it in the south and west. In some counties, the math only works for a few more decades. Fact 26. Nebraska has more miles of river than most states and almost no natural lakes. Nebraska has nearly 80,000 miles of rivers and streams, a staggering amount for a state that most people picture as bone dry. But flip that over. Despite all the flowing water, Nebraska has almost no natural permanent lakes. Just like Kansas to the south, every body of standing water you see on a map is a man-made reservoir, impounded behind one of the state's 2,900 plus dams. The largest, Lake McConaughey, holds 1.74 million acre-feet of water. But dig beneath any of those reservoirs, and you'll find that natural Nebraska has always been about rivers in motion, not water at rest. Fact 25. Nebraska's two-climate state doesn't just have different weather, it has different geography. Draw a line roughly down the middle of Nebraska along the 100th meridian, and you've divided two different worlds. East of that line, humid continent climate, annual rainfall over 30 inches, deciduous forests, rich dark soils, traditional farming country. West of it, semi-arid, 13 inches of rain per year on average, shortgrass prairie, sandy and rocky soils, ranching country. The panhandle uses mountain time. The rest of the state runs on central. Even the weather systems are different. The east gets hit by systems rolling from the Gulf. The west gets hammered by dry fronts dropping off the Rockies. Nebraska is two states quietly pretending to be one. Fact 24. Nebraska has a hidden canyon forest where eastern trees have no business growing. In the Pine Ridge of northwest Nebraska, a 100-mile escarpment of forest bluffs and rocky canyons cuts through the high plains. The ecology is almost identical to the Black Hills of South Dakota, 50 miles north. Ponderosa pines, mule deer, mountain bluebirds, and terrain that looks absolutely nothing like the Nebraska of postcards. Drive through it and you'll swear you've crossed a state line into Wyoming. The pines that grow here share roots with forests hundreds of miles away. The Pine Ridge is basically a biological extension of the Black Hills, separated from them by a geography that says it shouldn't be there. Fact 23. Nebraska has toadstool rock formations that geologists use as the worldwide standard. The Toadstool Geologic Park in northwest Nebraska isn't just bizarre to look at, it's scientifically indispensable. Geologists have designated the rock layers at Toadstool as the type section for the White River Geologic Group, meaning that every similar formation anywhere in North America is officially compared to this one Nebraska site as the global standard. When researchers in South Dakota, Colorado, or Wyoming find 30-million-year-old White River deposits, they reference Toadstool to date and identify them. Nebraska is the measuring stick by which ancient geology is understood across a continent. Fact 22. The Platte River built the Oregon Trail. The Oregon Trail didn't just go through Nebraska by accident. The Platte River Valley was the easiest natural corridor through the Great Plains, flat, well-watered, and following a gradual grade westward toward the mountains. Over 500,000 immigrants followed it between 1840 and 1870. The ruts their wagon wheels cut into the Nebraska earth are all still visible today in dozens of locations, pressed 4 to 6 inches deep into the ground that has been hardening for 150 years. The river that explorers mocked as too shallow to navigate was the road that built the American West. The Platte didn't carry boats, it carried a nation. Fact 21. Nebraska's highest waterfall is fed by a spring that never stops flowing. Smith Falls in north-central Nebraska drops 63 feet into a side canyon of Niobrara River in a curtain of water so consistent that it runs exactly the same in January as it does in July. That's because it isn't fed by rainfall or snowmelt. It's fed entirely by a spring, which draws from the Ogallala Aquifer seeping through the Sandhills above. No drought stops it. No summer heat slows it. It's a direct pipeline from the ancient water table through solid rock and out of a cliff face into open air. Nebraska's highest waterfall is a hole in the ground that the Ogallala keeps filling forever. Fact 20. Nebraska once had rhinoceroses, camels, and three-toed horses, all at the same time. The Asheville fossil record makes this unmistakable. 12 million years ago, Nebraska was a savanna that would have looked more like East Africa than the Great Plains. Barrel-bodied rhinoceroses that were surprisingly short and wide. Three-toed horses, much smaller than modern breeds. Camels that have evolved here in North America long before they migrated to Asia and Africa. Giant land tortoises. Saber-toothed predators circling the waterholes. This was Nebraska's Serengeti, buried under a foot of volcanic ash and preserved for us to find 12 million years later. The prairie you see today is the final chapter of a story that started in a very different world. Fact 19. Nebraska's Sandhills are home to one of the most intact ecosystems left on the Great Plains. The Sandhills are more than dunes. The World Wildlife Fund estimates that 85% of the ecoregion remains intact natural habitat, one of the highest percentages of any ecosystem remaining in the entire Great Plains. The ground has almost never been plowed because the sandy soil would blow away the moment anyone tried. What couldn't be farmed was preserved by accident. The result is a mosaic of wet meadows, alkaline lakes, and native mixed grass prairie that functions essentially the way it has for thousands of years. In a region where virtually everything else has been converted to cropland, the Sandhills simply refused. Fact 18. Nebraska's Sandhills contain more than 2,000 shallow lakes. Tucked beneath the dunes, the Sandhills hold over 2,000 shallow lakes and wetlands, most of them invisible from any road. These aren't reservoirs, they're natural interdunal lakes, formed where the water table rises between dune ridges and pools at the surface. Some are freshwater, some are alkaline, creating environments that mirror coastal salt marshes. All of them are fed by the Ogallala below and support an extraordinary concentration of migratory waterfowl, shorebirds, and grassland species. The Sandhills are not a desert with some lakes. They are one of the most complex wetland systems in the United States, hiding inside a sand dune field. Fact 17. The 100th meridian splits Nebraska, and it splits the continent's weather. The 100th meridian is not an arbitrary line. It's the boundary where the reliable rains of the eastern half of North America essentially stop. East of it, you can farm without irrigation. West of it, you generally cannot. That line runs almost directly through the heart of Nebraska. Early American explorers used this as a western edge of habitable land. Everything beyond was labeled the Great American Desert on their maps, including most of what is now Nebraska's Panhandle. The desert turned out to contain the Sandhills, the Pine Ridge, the North Platte River Valley, and Chimney Rock. The explorers weren't entirely wrong about the rain. They were entirely wrong about everything else. Fact 16. Nebraska has a forest made of trees planted by the government to stop the wind. After the Dust Bowl stripped the Great Plains of topsoil in the 1930s, the federal government launched the Prairie States Forestry Project, a New Deal initiative to plant 220 million trees in a 100-mile wide belt stretching from Canada to Texas directly through Nebraska. These shelter belts were rows of trees planted at the edges of fields to break the wind, slow erosion, and prevent another ecological catastrophe. Thousands of miles of them still line Nebraska's roadside and field borders. Drive across eastern Nebraska today, and those rows of cottonwoods and cedars define the horizon. Nebraska's skyline was redesigned by the federal government after the land nearly blew away. Fact 15. A dust bowl hit Nebraska so hard it turned afternoon into night. The 1930s hit Nebraska the same way they hit Kansas. Black blizzards of topsoil rolling across the prairie and blotting out the sun. The cause was the same too. Decades of plowing had stripped away the deep-rooted native grass that had anchored the soil for thousands of years, and when the drought came, there was nothing left to hold the earth down. In some Nebraska counties, farms were simply abandoned, towns empty. People packed everything they owned into cars and drove west. The soil that those farmers had plowed through in a generation had taken 5,000 years to build. That math doesn't get better. Fact 14. Nebraska still carries the Dust Bowl's fingerprints. The Dust Bowl ended 90 years ago, but Nebraska still wears its scars. The shelter belts planted after the disaster still stand. The abandoned farmsteads still dot the emptied counties of the Sandhills where people simply gave up and left. The soil loss from those years was irreversible, not on any human timescale, and the lesson was written into state law. Nebraska today has some of the most carefully regulated groundwater usage of any state in the Great Plains, a direct response to watching the surface water destroy itself once and the determination not to let the same thing happen underground. Fact 13. Nebraska is ground zero for one of the biggest water crises in the world. The Ogallala Aquifer is being pumped at a rate roughly equivalent to 18 Colorado rivers per year across its range. In Nebraska, the situation is better than in Kansas or Texas. The Sandhills recharge the aquifer here more effectively than anywhere else in its range, and some parts of the Nebraska aquifer have actually risen. But in northwest Nebraska, the Republican River Basin levels have dropped significantly, and the pressure to keep irrigating shows no signs of easing. Nebraska has more to lose from the Ogallala depletion than almost any state, and more reason to be the one that figures out how to stop it. Fact 12. Nebraska has one of the most violent tornado corridors on Earth. Nebraska sits squarely in Tornado Alley. The state's geography is essentially a perfect tornado factory. Warm, moist air pushing north from the Gulf of Mexico slams into cold, dry air sliding east off the Rockies, and the collision produces supercell thunderstorms on a scale found almost nowhere on Earth. Nebraska records an average of 57 tornadoes per year. The flat, open terrain gives those tornadoes nothing to break them up once they form. And the vast low-population Sandhills means that plenty of tornadoes touch down and run for miles without anyone ever recording them. The true tornado count in Nebraska is almost certainly higher than the official number. Fact 11. Nebraska has its own version of the ocean, on the prairie. When the wind hits the Sandhills at full speed, the grass moves in waves. Not metaphorically, literally, in coordinated rolling waves that sweep across the hills like swells on open water. The novelist Jim Harrison once wrote that standing in the Sandhills, the vastness and waving of the hilly grasslands in the wind make you smell salt. He wasn't alone. Multiple early explorers compared the experience to being at sea. The same disorientation, the same scale, the same sense that the horizon goes on forever and you are very small inside it. The Sandhills cover 20,000 square miles. It takes a long time to stop feeling like you're drowning in it. Fact 10. Nebraska is home to the oldest fossils of modern horse evolution anywhere on Earth. Nebraska's Fossil Freeway, a corridor of fossil-rich sites running across the state, has produced some of the most important evidence for horse evolution in the scientific record. The three-toed horse at Ashfall, the one-toed modern ancestors found across the Sandhills. The complete sequence of horse evolution from small forest browsers to large grassland runners is documented in Nebraska's rocks in more detail than almost anywhere else on Earth. Horses evolved in North America, spread to Asia and Africa across land bridges, survived for millions of years, and then went extinct here, only to be reintroduced by the Spanish. Nebraska was their birthplace, and Nebraska has their bones. Fact 9. Nebraska hosts the only national forest in America planted entirely by hand. The Nebraska National Forest near Halsey is 25,000 acres of trees that should not exist. Every single one of them was hand-planted, seedling by seedling, in sand. When the project started in 1902, the scientific establishment said it couldn't be done. The botanist who believed it could, Charles Bessey, was considered a crank. Roosevelt gave him the land anyway. Today, it's the largest hand-planted forest in the United States, a green island in the middle of a sand dune sea, and proof that one scientist's conviction, backed by one president's authority, can change the landscape of an entire state. In 2022, a wildfire burned through part of it. They're already replanting. Fact 8. Nebraska's rivers built the only major east-west corridor through the plains. Before the Oregon Trail, before the railroads, the rivers of Nebraska had already established a corridor that would carry an entire nation westward. The Platte, the North Platte, the Niobrara. These rivers ran east to west, following the grade of the land toward the Rockies on almost perfectly navigable paths. Every major transportation artery in Nebraska today, highways, railroads, pipelines, follow river valleys that the rivers themselves carved out over millions of years. The infrastructure of the American West was drawn first in water. Fact 7. Nebraska has a spring-fed river that keeps waterfalls running even in drought. The Niobrara River is unlike most of its neighbors because it doesn't depend on rainfall. More than 90% of the Loup River's flow, and a huge percentage of the Niobrara's, originates as groundwater seeping up from the Ogallala through the Sandhills and emerging in hundreds of springs along the valley floor. This means that Niobrara's water levels barely fluctuate between wet years and drought years. The waterfalls run year-round. The river stays clear and cold. While rivers across the Great Plains shrink and vanish during drought, the Niobrara keeps flowing because it isn't drawing from the sky. It's drawing from a water table that took tens of thousands of years to fill. Fact 6. There are ancient bison kill sites in Nebraska where thousands of animals were driven off cliffs. The Hudson-Mang Bison Kill Site in northwestern Nebraska contains the bones of nearly 600 bison, piled in layers and dating back 10,000 years. Evidence suggests early humans drove the animals into a natural trap, like a canyon or an arroyo, and slaughtered them en masse. Across the broader region, archaeologists have found multiple sites where generations of plains people developed sophisticated hunting strategies that used Nebraska's terrain against the animals. The land wasn't just lived on, it was used as a weapon. Those canyons and breaks that make the Panhandle so dramatic were killing grounds for one of the most effective hunting cultures in human history. Fact 5. Nebraska's Platte River is now narrowing, and that is slowly erasing a migration. The sandhill cranes that have used the Platte for 9 million years depend on an open, braided channels with clear sightlines. Those channels are closing. Reduced flows from upstream dams and irrigation withdrawals have allowed willows, cottonwoods, and invasive plants to colonize the sandbars and riverbanks. Where the Platte was once a mile wide, it's now hundreds of feet in many stretches, and as the channel narrows, the cranes have fewer places to roost. Conservation organizations now spend millions of dollars annually physically clearing vegetation from the Platte's banks. chainsaw and bulldozer, just to keep the river open enough for the migration that has used it since before humans existed. Fact 4. The sandhill crane has been flying through Nebraska for longer than the Rocky Mountains have been their current height. The fossil record confirms sandhill cranes migrating through Nebraska for at least 9 million years. The Rocky Mountains, which those same cranes fly over on their route to Alaska, have only been at their current elevation for about 6 to 10 million years, which means the cranes were doing this route before the mountains finished rising. They adapted as the Rockies grew. They watched the Platte River form below them. The river they now depend on didn't even exist yet when cranes first started using the corridor. They are, by any measure, one of the most ancient living links to a completely different version of this continent. Fact 3. Nebraska invented Arbor Day because it had no trees. J. Sterling Morton moved to Nebraska Territory in 1854 and was appalled by the treelessness of the plains. He spent years advocating for tree planting as both a practical and patriotic act. In 1872, he convinced Nebraska to establish the first Arbor Day on April 10th, offering prizes to counties that planted the most trees. An estimated 1 million trees were planted on the first day alone. The holiday spread to every state and eventually to countries around the world. Nebraska created the global tradition of tree planting specifically because it had no trees. The most treeless state in the nation gave trees to the planet. Fact 2. Nebraska's flattest-looking terrain is eroding from underground, one dissolved salt layer at a time. Like Kansas to the south, Nebraska sits on extensive beds of soluble limestone, salts, and gypsum. Groundwater slowly dissolves these underground layers, creating voids that can cause the surface above to sag and collapse. Sinkholes, subsidence craters, and shallow lake basins across the state are the visible evidence of this invisible process. The land looks solid. It isn't. Not entirely. Underground, water is winning its slow argument with rock. Nebraska's surface is not a permanent thing. It's just the current outcome of a negotiation between ancient geology and moving water that has been ongoing for millions of years. Fact 1. Nebraska, the land that never stops becoming. So after all of that, here's the biggest fact of all. Nebraska is never finished. Every spring, 500,000 cranes pass through on a route they've flown for 9 million years, following a river that's slowly narrowing under them. The Sandhills dunes press against their grass cover, waiting for the rain to stop. The Ogallala drops another fraction of a foot beneath the fields. Chimney Rock loses another sliver of sandstone to the wind. The Platte, the river the state was named after, shifts its channels one more time in a slow migration that never ends. Nebraska may look like a permanent, unchanging flat line on the map, but it's a land in constant negotiation with its own geology, its own water, its own sky, redrawing itself 1 inch at a time. And that's probably the wildest fact of all.